One of the first steps to growing in the kitchen as part of the purposeful growing journey or on your homestead journey, is to cook from scratch. Today, I'm going to talk about the benefits of cooking from scratch. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on how you can make it easier for you and your family, and talk about the importance of it. Why cooking from scratch is important, especially when you're growing your own food. Let's get growing. Hello, and welcome to the Pray Just Plant podcast, the show that talks about growing a garden, a homestead, a healthy family, and most importantly, growing closer to God. I'm your host, Crystal Media, owner of the Red Ridge Farm Homestead, where our mission is to help women of faith find the courage to grow healthy food for their family while building a closer relationship with our Lord and Savior. If that's you, don't let the world hold you back. Pray Just Plant. Hello, fellow growers, and welcome to the Pray Just Plant podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Media, and today we're going to talk about cooking from scratch. As part of the growing journey, as part of creating purpose in your home, growing your own food, one of the essential steps of the purposeful kitchen or growing in your kitchen is to learn to cook from scratch. Now, sometimes that can seem really daunting, but today we're going to walk through the benefits, the importance of, and I'm going to give you some tips and tricks or some top hacks to help you make that process a little bit easier when you decide and take on cooking from scratch in your home. So before we get into all of that, I want you to take a moment. If you're driving, don't close your eyes, but I want you to just take a moment and think about this scene that I'm going to lay out for you. Kind of imagine the scene: a cozy farmhouse kitchen, the warmth of the crackling fire, and the aroma of homemade bread wafting through the air. In a world where convenience often reigns supreme, there's something truly magical about cooking from scratch on the homestead. It's a journey that takes us back to our roots. It reconnects us with the land. So homesteading is all about, right? And allows us to savor the true essence of food. But it doesn't all have to be just the nostalgia and the romantic notions. You can cook from scratch too. Sometimes that word, even cooking from scratch, in some of us, it paints that picture, right, of that cozy kitchen. But for some of us, it's dread. We're like, I don't even know where to start. Oh, that looks so nice. Yeah, I would love fresh home-cooked bread. But does cooking from scratch have to go that far right away? Or can it just be some different things that you tweak right now, especially when you're growing your own food? But is that scene something you want? Is that scene something you crave in your homesteading journey? Is that connection not only to growing your food, but cooking your own food? Cooking not only because you have to, but that love of cooking to create that aroma, to create that connection to our land, connection back to our roots. And then I hope you really enjoy this episode, because we're going to dive in to really show you that cooking from scratch, yeah, that's a huge word, right? Cooking from scratch does not need to be as hard as you think it is. And if you're wavering on the edge still to have that dream, but you just don't know how, why that even is something you need to be doing nowadays, right? We're going to talk about the benefits and the importance of too. So let's start with a benefit with a little bit of importance as well. One huge benefit of cooking from scratch is going to be enhanced flavor and quality. Even if you're not growing your own food, when you're cooking from scratch, you're using whole foods. That means the foods are going to be fresher. Even if you're purchasing them from a grocery store, you're buying not frozen broccoli, but you're buying fresh broccoli, and you're steaming it yourself, and you're preparing it for your family yourself. And that is going to improve its taste and its quality. In a class that I teach, I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's about garden planning. I think it's Garden Planning Like a Pro. I talk about the first essentials of why it's important to grow your own food. And I think this connects to it as well. When we have whole foods, less nutrients is lost. So in that class, I talk about how green beans, and this is just a vegetable because, of course, in that class we're talking about a garden, how green beans lose their nutrient value just in cooking. They lose, I think, 20%. So if you pick them fresh out of your garden, you bring them in, you put them in a pot, you boil them, steam them, cook them, and then consume them, they've already lost 20% of their nutrients. Now, think about this in aspects of buying grocery produce. Now, not only when they pick it and bring it to the grocery store, there's another, I think it's 15% of nutrients is lost in that of the wait time, because you didn't have any wait time when you picked it in your garden, put it in your pot. But you're having that wait time from when they picked it, it's going on a truck, they're washing it, cleaning it, it's going on a truck, it's being drove to your local grocery store, then it's sitting on the shelf for when you decide to go get it. In that time, and especially in how many days, I think it's 2 to 3% of the nutrients is lost every day that the produce sits without being consumed. And then in the process of cooking is that 20%. So you could lose technically up to almost 50% of that nutrient value in that food, even still eating whole foods from the grocery store. So not only is growing your own food really important to bring higher nutrients to your table, but cooking from scratch, even if you're not growing your own food, is still going to bring higher nutrients. And frozen is better than canned, because all that's happened with frozen is they're blanched slightly, which loses only about 10%, and then they go into like hibernation. That nutrient sits there and waits for you to consume it. So freezing is an amazing way if you're buying vegetables from the grocery store and trying to buy in bulk. Frozen is better. The importance in this is the nutritional value is important when it comes to choosing better food for your family, and that cooking from scratch will help with that, because not only are you going to be using fresh whole materials, but you're going to be able to control the quantity of the ingredient. So another example I have of this is I make my own grape juice. The ball recipe that I got from my mother-in-law says that she uses 1 cup of sugar per quart. I have never used that much sugar in that recipe. I've actually cut it in half. I only use half a cup of sugar. So in that, by preserving my own food or cooking something that is like foods that we like from the grocery store or foods that we used to eat, I can manage what actually is going into that food. So when you look at that processed casserole or green beans and you see all the other ingredients, I can simply say that in my canned green beans, there's water, salt, and green beans. Those are the only ingredient. Where if you look at other green beans, you're going to find some preservatives and lots more, but you're also going to be able to just choose better ingredients like sugar. A lot of people say that sugar gets a bad rap. And yes, sugar in excessive should be getting a bad rap. But what about using raw sugar? That's going to be sugar that, yes, is sugar, but it's not going to be as chemically treated as the white sugar. Because when you get sugar organically, it is not white. It is cream colored. And you're still getting a healthier sugar, but you're not having to go into the fake sugars. So you can choose what you're going to put in your food because you have complete control of the ingredients. You can even, not only if you're not even growing your own, making sure that what you're cooking from scratch can be sourced organically or sustainably. You can ensure that the meals are not only bursting with flavor, but also really high in nutrients, like we talked about before. And you can also ensure that they're pesticide free. So when you are cooking from scratch, you get to make loads more choices, which can seem overwhelming, I know, but you can also choose better alternatives. You can choose to use honey instead of sugar. You can choose to use maple syrup instead of honey. You can choose to use whole wheat flour instead of processed flour, or you can choose to grind your own flour, or you can, there's so many levels to growing your own food and preserving and gathering your own food, but it also gets into the cooking from scratch. I think that is one of the most important benefits for me when it comes to cooking from scratch, is that we can choose the ingredients. We can choose to use our homegrown food. I can choose to use food from the neighbors. I can choose to use the levels of ingredients that are more healthy for my family instead of having to just deal with, like grape juice. If you read the ingredients, has a lot more sugar than it needs to. because if you taste grapes, homegrown grapes off the vine, they're sweet. They don't need a lot of sugar. You can also monitor your salts. You can use different kinds of salts. My husband deals with a little bit of a thyroid problem with different foods, so we use a lot of Himalayan salt here on the homestead. By cooking from scratch, you can change and elevate the quality of meals. And in that, you can do the next thing, which is you can utilize your own harvest. So you've been working really hard in growing your own food. You have a garden. You may have raised meat chickens this year. And now, by cooking from scratch on your homestead, you can utilize that. You can have essentially a farm-to-table experience on a whole new level that will allow you to fully embrace the bounty of your land. Whether you have a small vegetable patch or a thriving orchard, or maybe you're getting some apples from the neighbor, or your chickens are producing fresh eggs, you can incorporate all of that, especially when it comes to cooking from scratch. And in my book, Planning Beyond the Harvest, and in my planner, Planning Beyond the Harvest, I talk about this because one of the big hurdles I have found in preserving my own food and growing my own food is connecting that to recipes. So yes, I've been growing my own food for 20 plus years. Slowly over the 20 years, I have changed the way I cook, the way I consume food, and all of that because it wraps around my harvest now. And that was something that took 20 years to learn. And that's why I wanted to write this book and get this planner out to you guys, is because what it does is it teaches you how to jump that hurdle from now you're growing your own food and you have 20 broccoli that you just harvested from your garden, and now you don't know what to do. See, this is like that beyond the harvest. You work so hard to get to the harvest, but sometimes we don't make a plan for beyond that. And I struggled with that for years. I would grow so much food, and then I was slowly learning how to preserve. Well, I wasn't knowing how to cook with the things that I was preserving, so some of that went to waste, my green bean story, or they would just sit there in beautiful little jars on my shelves because I didn't have recipes to connect to those. And in that planner, and what I teach is to help you make that connection to be, okay, I have 20 broccoli. I really love these 5 recipes from broccoli. 2 of them take canned broccoli, 3 of them take frozen broccoli, and 1 takes fresh. So I can use some fresh broccoli now and make this recipe, and I can preserve broccoli in these 2 different ways for these 2 recipes, or I can just maybe tweak this cooking from scratch recipe, because you can do that as well, to accommodate frozen broccoli, because I just want to freeze all my broccoli. So then you freeze all your broccoli, but then you have a plan. So by knowing the recipe, that's the cooking with scratch part, you can then preserve your produce in the way that you need it for that recipe, and so it kind of goes backwards. There's about 5 steps to planning beyond the harvest. Is yes, you plan for the harvest so that you're harvesting at peak. Number 2, that you plan all the utilities that you need. What recipes are you going to do? Then you preserve it, and then you pick it because you're going to pick at the right time. Then you preserve it, and then you start utilizing it with those recipes that you have. And I think that's a huge hurdle that I have overcome, and that's what I wanted to teach you. And that's also a huge hurdle that learning to cook from scratch is going to help you with, because utilizing your own harvest is going to help you take your food you consume. It's going to be higher nutrition, all of the things, but you're also going to be able to connect it back to how you're preserving and what you love to eat. Because when you start growing your own food and then cooking that food, it is a connection that you will only experience when you do that. I think one of the huge downfalls of society nowadays is we have lost that connection to our food. When we go to the grocery store, we see chicken breasts and we just see the chicken breast. We don't see the chicken behind the chicken breast. We don't see that life. Or when we look at our herbs, we just see the basil and the thyme and we just think, oh, that'll be great. But when you grow your own basil and then you grow your own homegrown chicken, and you saw that chicken as a little baby chick, and you see it grow, and you know you gave it its best life, and then you see that price that chicken paid to feed you, the aroma that wafts from your kitchen when you're roasting that chicken in basil and thyme is going to be something that not only gives you pride in your accomplishment, but it's going to be a connection that is way deeper than anyone just going to the grocery store is ever going to have with their food. And I think it comes to anything, growing your own vegetables, growing your own everything. When we take that next step and we cook it for ourselves and we learn to cook recipes that we love and we utilize our own dishes, we can harness so much goodness for ourselves because we're going to be utilizing those ingredients at the peak of freshness and flavor, and we're going to be cooking them when and how we truly want. And we can even connect them to the seasons. There's so much more to cooking from scratch with your own harvest than I could even describe here because there's just so much to it. And I would love for you guys to get into that book. It's called Planning Beyond the Harvest ebook. And then there's also my planner that walks you through how to plan your garden a little bit with the end result in mind, not the beginning result in mind. I think a lot of times that's all we focus on is the beginning, the planting and the sowing of the seed. But this planner helps you come at it from the harvest end. And that's our essential goal, is it not? It's the harvest. So I hope you check both of those out. I will put them in the show notes and then in the description below. So what are the show notes? Well, the show notes are where I have accumulated different links for you or connected a blog post to this episode, and you can dive into this topic that we're talking about more, and I will put the link below so that you can go to the show notes of this episode. And if you are listening to the Courageous Plant podcast, there's lots of different show notes out there for all the episodes for you to really dive in and learn more about the topics that are in each episode. So before we get into the next benefit and importance of cooking from scratch, it's time to jump into the tips and tricks segment of this episode where I share a seasonal tip that I'm utilizing right now on the homestead so I know it will help you. This week's tip is brought to you by the Planning Beyond the Harvest handbook. This handbook was designed to help you get your harvest onto your family's plates. We grow all this delicious food, and sometimes in the garden planning, we forget about the harvest and beyond the harvest. This workbook will walk you through the 5 steps that I use to get beyond the harvest. You can grab your copy at redridgefarm.org/resources. Well, here we are in September. The season's almost wrapped up, at least here in Wyoming. So, have you thought about prepping your perennials for fall? It's time to mulch those trees. It's time to protect those strawberries by covering them with straw, if that's what you need to do in your area. And it's time to be thinking about preparing those perennials for the snow to come. And even in preparing your garden for the snow to come, have you planted your cover crops yet? Have you laid down any tarps to protect your soil? Our soil needs that protection. So be thinking about preparing for fall in your garden and on the homestead this week. I hope you enjoyed that tip and trick, and now it's time for the next benefit or importance of cooking from scratch, and that is that it can be cost effective and budget friendly. And in those two aspects, we can easily talk about when you grow your own food, you're saving money. Yes, that's important. But I think cooking from scratch goes a little bit deeper. When we have our conveniences, sometimes those conveniences come with a higher price tag. I know that I can make homemade pizza a lot cheaper than buying a frozen pizza. In my grocery store right now, if I want to buy a pizza that has organic ingredients on it, it's going to be $8 to $9 a single pizza. Now, my family of growing boys can eat 3 of those. So if I look at $8 times 3, that's $24 for one meal. Now, when I think about the ingredients that a pizza needs, and I think about them in buying them whole from the grocery store, like the flour and the yeast and all of the things, I may spend more than that $25 because in our family, we purchase things in bulk. So what that means is that when we buy flour, we buy it in the 50-pound bag. And by doing that, yes, that 50-pound bag is, I think the organic flour that I just got was like $68. And it is sourced from a mill that I think is like 500 miles from my home. So I have those things right. It's organic and it's sourced locally. 500 miles for Wyoming is pretty close. $68 wasn't a huge price, but that's 50 pounds of flour. So if I were to divide that down to how much 3 cups of flour would be, which I think it's about a pound. So that puts it at maybe $6.80. No, that would be 10 pounds. Oh, I can't do the math. You guys do the math for me. It's not very expensive. It's maybe a couple dollars for the dough that needed to do that 3 cups of flour, which essentially makes 2 large pizzas for my family. That is enough. So that's only about $2 there. And then the pasta sauce or the marinara pizza sauce to buy an organic jar of that is like $6. So that's a huge jar. So if I were to can my own, all I would have is the cost of the seed, which is about $2 for the whole package. So maybe those 2 or 3 pounds of tomatoes cost me maybe $2. So I could make full organic pasta sauce with the right amount of sugar that I want. Not so much sugar that producers that produce the spaghetti sauce for the grocery store doesn't make its own food. And then of course the cheese, I have to outsource cheese. I don't make my own cheese. So I'm looking at taking a meal that costs $24 to about, I'd say 10. So that is a very big cost. That's a big difference. That saves $14. That $14 can go into either 2 more pizzas or so much more. But sometimes we look at that huge cost of the $68 for that flour as Whole Foods costs more. But when we're buying in bulk and we're cooking more from scratch, that 50 pounds of flour could probably produce, if I was just making bread, 100 loaves of bread. Yeah, because it's 3 cups of flour. No, it's 6 cups of flour. So 50 loaves of bread. That's a lot of bread. So if you think about all the other things you can cook with it, that is a huge savings. And so if you are buying in bulk, you may be spending a little bit more money up front, but in the end, it's more cost effective because you're going to be able to produce more from it. And not only are you producing more from what you're purchasing better ingredients, and you're bringing down the cost of your food. How can it be budget friendly? Well, budget friendly means that you don't always have to purchase things on a whim. You can have a meal plan. You can have a list of ingredients that you're going to need for those meals that you're going to make. And with that 50 pounds flour, you could already have some of the ingredients you already need at home because you've purchased them ahead of time. So it could reduce your grocery bill, especially for myself when we grow a lot of I think it's up to like 75% of our own food. Cooking from scratch, you are saving money because you know the ingredients. You can buy your ingredients in bulk ahead of time. You can also meal plan. And when you do that, you go to the grocery store with a list. When you have a list at the grocery store, you're not going to buy those whim purchases. You also don't go to the grocery store hungry, right? But when you go to the grocery store, you're going to know exactly what you need. You're not going to be getting things that, oh, this is on sale or this is on sale. You're going to be able to be on target for your budget. You're also going to be able to be on target for the things that you need to purchase. And you can buy things in bulk and you can buy things on sale. One of the big things that I do is I don't buy the cube cheese anymore because it doesn't freeze as well. But the shredded cheese freezes amazing. So when the shredded cheese goes on sale at my grocery store, we use a lot of it. I buy it in bulk. I buy 6 or 7 bags of it and put it in my freezer. And it's there. I can have it on hand. Because when I go grocery shopping, or when I make my grocery list, first thing I do, and I talk about that in my Planning Beyond the Harvest book and also my meal planning, because the Planning Beyond the Harvest planner helps you with meal planning, because remember, our meals are the end goal. I talk about where the first place you should go shopping is your larder first, is your pantry, is your freezer. Because when you have a list of like, I'm going to think of my list for this week. We have sour cream enchiladas. We have hamburgers and french fries. We have chicken stir fry, chicken and stuffing, and anywho, I can't remember. But I can look at that and I can say, okay, these are the ingredients I need for this. We have hamburger, check. We don't have sliced cheese. I need to get that. I have the flour to make hamburger buns and all the things to make hamburger buns. Check. Yeah, I just bought a bag of potatoes and I bought 20 pounds of potatoes. We're good on potatoes. I'm good with that. The other thing you can do also in that meal planning is you can look at your larder first before you decide what you're going to cook, because you have the ingredients. So cooking from scratch is going to be cost effective and budget friendly because you're going to have a greater connection to your food. You're going to be able to purchase in bulk. You're going to be able to meal plan and look ahead. And the things that you're buying are whole foods. That means that you can preserve them yourself, or they can be bought in bulk. And you're going to maybe have to spend a little bit more time in the kitchen, which we're going to talk about in a minute, because I've got a few hacks for you to reduce the time in the kitchen, even though you're cooking from scratch. And all of that can help you save money. So our next topic is you can still make your own convenience foods. So with that, especially when we're talking about frozen pizzas, and my kids love going to, what is it called? It's a Japanese grill, and they love fried rice from there. Can't remember. Even though there's some foods out there that we really love, and there was some convenience foods that I still like to purchase sometimes, like frozen pizza every once in a while when I'm exhausted from grocery shopping in town all day, we can still make those convenience foods for ourselves. We don't have to purchase them all. And it's absolutely okay to do this. I think one of the big things when it comes to cooking from scratch is we think that everything has to take forever. We have to make our own bread. We have to do all these things. And you can, and I'm going to share a few tips in just a minute about how you can do all these things, but you can still make convenience foods. One of the big convenience foods that I did was, instead of a few years ago when we grew a lot of our potatoes, I canned them. Instead of just keeping them down in the root cellar, I had the kids spend one whole day. We peeled like 30 pounds of potatoes. I cut them all up, put them in jars, canned them. And so when it came to stew, all I had to do was pour those potatoes in, and all I had to do was warm them. When it came to cooking, my kids I bake them in butter and parsley and garlic powder and onion powder, and they just love them. And I didn't have to cook them all the way through. I could make it more convenient. Instead of taking 30 to 40 minutes in the oven, I could pour and drain off those potatoes. I could pour those onto a pan, pour a bunch of butter and parsley and all the spices on it, bake them for 10 minutes because all I was doing was warming them, and we had supper. I've made stew. I've made canned chicken. I've done a lot of different things. You can still make your own convenience foods. And I know that's not so much as a benefit. I think it can be a benefit because you're making those convenience foods more healthy. But I think a lot of times when it comes to cooking from scratch, we feel like we have to do it all. We have to make everything like Martha Stewart-ish, and it doesn't have to be that way. I want to tell you right now, it does not have to be that way. Cooking from scratch does not need to be that intimidating. And I think that's important, and as a benefit too, is because when we cook from scratch, we're doing better ingredients, but we can also put in some conveniences that cooking not from scratch doesn't allow, especially when we're meal planning and such. When we know, especially that's what I talk about in my planner, when we know know the end result is going to be spaghetti sauce, then when we are growing our own food, we can connect it and still make that convenience food. It is completely okay to make those convenience foods. I've even made my own frozen pizza. I have made the dough and I've laid it out on a pan and I stuck it in the freezer and froze it. I bought these Tupperware, they're bigger circular Tupperware containers. I can put 2 or 3 crusts in there, and then all I need to do is pull out a crust and I have pizza. I've also done where I freeze some of my dough. So if, just like in the grocery store, right, you want to make rolls, well, you can pull out the frozen dough and make rolls. You can do those same things that the grocery store are doing to make convenience foods. You could even make your own granola bars. You can even make, and this might even seem like more things. It's like, oh, now I got to make my own granola bars and all this kind of stuff. I'm not saying that. What I'm trying to say is that you can do that. You can still have your favorite foods like pizza, or maybe you like it frozen pizza, or you like granola bars. Even though you are trying to eat more healthy and grow your own food, you can still have some of those things, especially when you make it yourself, because I've made my own barbecue sauce, I've made my own salad dressing, I've made my own salsa, I've made all of those things. You can still do that. So in the next segment, I'm going to share with you the top hacks, there's about 5 of them, top hacks for successful from scratch cooking. But now it is time for the Growing with God segment, where you and I dive into the Bible and learn more and connect with our Lord and Savior. Today we're back in the Faith in Action series in Hebrews 11. You can enjoy the previous episodes of this series or previous segments of this series in some new episodes that are coming out. I'm putting about 3 segments together, or you can go back to the previous episodes in season 10 and season 9. I think it goes all the way back to season 9 to find the different segments. But we have gone all the way from Hebrews 11, 1 through 21. And today we're going to be in verse 22. So that's Hebrews 11, verse 22. This whole chapter on Hebrews talks about faith in action. This is Paul talking to the Hebrew church about not only believing in God, but taking action in our faith. And he's using examples that are in the Bible, examples that we can go look up, and we're going to today, to learn more from, to understand what faith maybe Joseph had, that's what we're going to talk about today, or Noah or Abraham, what faith they had, and how we can use those examples for our own faith in action. Because God asks us to believe, but he also asks us to put our faith into action. And why does he ask us to do that? So others can see Jesus reflecting through him, and also so that our lives can slowly start to reflect Jesus's, so that we can feel more whole, feel more connected to our Lord and Savior. So let's jump into Hebrews 11, verse 22. Now, these are really small verses, but they pack a mighty punch. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. So that seems like a very simple verse, but let's break it apart a little bit. Who's Joseph? Okay, Joseph is the boy with the coat of many colors. He's the one that God gave him the ability to interpret dreams. He was the youngest or second to youngest son of Jacob, and his brothers, out of their jealousy, sold him into slavery. So you know who Joseph is, right? You've probably heard this story before. And in the last segment, we talked about how Jacob, Joseph's father, before he died, blessed Joseph's sons, as well as Isaac blessed Jacob and Ishmael. We talked about that. So we got those little bit of connections. So Joseph grew up as a slave. He became the slave to Potiphar. Then he was thrown into prison. Then he interprets some dreams, and then he interprets some dreams for the king. And then he saved the Egyptian people because of the famine. And through that, he also saved his own family because Israel was also plagued by that same famine, and his brothers and family were hungry, and so they came to Egypt and got his grain that they had saved up in Egypt. And then he eventually showed himself to his family. His brothers were shocked. You got to read the whole story. It's an amazing story because one great part of that story is that it shows that God has a plan. Even though Joseph didn't know the plan, even though part of the plan was him to be thrown into prison, it still was for Joseph and his family's good. Then it continues that he saves the Israelites, everybody moves to Egypt to get through the famine, and then eventually we get into the great Exodus, right? In his speaking, we're going to go back to Genesis and read it. We're going to see a little bit that he really believed that God was going to take care of the Israelites, and it was not for them to be slaves of Egypt. So we're going to go back to Genesis 50. Now, Genesis, the chapters before that are the whole story of Joseph, but we're going to go to 50, and this is after all the Israelites have moved to Egypt. They've been given the area of Goshen to live in. Joseph's father, Jacob, has just passed away, and brothers are worried about what was going to happen. And then Joseph says these words. So this is Genesis 50, verse 22. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children, also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, who were placed at birth on Joseph's knee. So those are his two sons, so his great-grandkids. He got to see all of them. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised and on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob is his father. And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. So that is our reference to the verse in Hebrews 11. Joseph had so much faith in God's plan, so much faith in what God was going to do, because he promised that oath to Abraham and Isaac, that he knew that God was going to do what he said he was going to do. And he sees that not only in the oath of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he also sees that in his story, technically, in his story, in who he was, in what God had taken him through. He had helped him interpret dreams. And Joseph says this over and over again, that he only interprets dreams through God's will. And then he also only could save Egypt by interpreting the dream and making sure they were storing up their harvest through God's will, through God's plan. And he also saw that even though his brothers betrayed him, even though he was thrown in prison when Potiphar's wife betrayed him, all of that was for the good. And we can kind of see that in another verse just before this, where he's reassuring his brothers. This is shortly right after Jacob died, which is shortly right after when the Israelites came to Egypt. So this is Genesis 50, 15 through 21. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? Remember, they sold him into slavery. So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I asked you to forgive your brothers the sin and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? This is a question. He's saying that he is not in God's shoes. He is saying that God is the one who delivered them. They see it a little bit that Joseph is the one that delivered him, and that Joseph is the one that kind of has control over their lives. But Joseph doesn't see it that way. He sees it that God has control of their lives, and all of the things that happened was God's plan, and it all worked out, even though Joseph went through some hard times, even though Joseph's brothers went through some hard times, even though they just lost their father. All of this still was God's plan, and God's plan, which he says in 24, was that God is going to take you to the promised land. So let's finish 20. This is Genesis 50:20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So not only did Joseph, and through God's plan, help save his brothers and the rest of the Israelites, he also saved all the Egyptians as well. There was many people that were saved from that famine because of how God worked through Joseph. So 21. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. So they were really worried. All Joseph's brothers were worried because now they're in Egypt and they could have easily become slaves, which does eventually happen after Joseph passed away. The Israelites become slaves to the Egyptians. That's not how Joseph saw it. He saw it that God intended your harm that you had for me for good, even though it didn't seem like it at the time. So by faith, if we come back to Hebrews 11, verse 22, by faith, Joseph tells his brothers that God's going to fulfill his plan. He always has, even though it may not be exactly how we see the plan should be happening. It's going to happen. He's going to fulfill it. So please promise to me that you're going to take my bones from Egypt back with you to the promised land, because I am part of your family. I am not an Egyptian. I am part of your family, and I want to be part of that family. And as we know, when the Israelites are and the Exodus do leave and the Exodus does happen, the 12 tribes of Israel are the 12 sons of Jacob, including Joseph's 2 sons get split off because Joseph's not there, and these other brothers are not there as well, but their children and children are there, because that happens like 500 years after Joseph brings all the Israelites to Egypt. So that's a whole other story, and we can get deep down into it, but I think the essence of this, I think what's really trying to be shown here is that by Joseph's faith in God, he could trust in God's plan. He could trust that even though some things were not great, he was put in jail, he was sold into slavery, he was mistreated by Potiphar's wife, he was threatened to die in jail. He interpreted some dreams that were not so fun. He was called in front of the king and pretty much not necessarily threatened, but had a little bit of fear for his life. All of those things were not good, but the overall plan was good. The overall plan was still step by step, took the Israelites, saved them from the famine, saved Joseph's family, so saved Joseph, reconnected Joseph with his family, and not only in a servant Lord relationship, but in a true family relationship. Even though the bad things happened, it all turned out for good. And we can see that in our own lives. We can see that by faith in God, by faith in believing that Jesus came, died, rose again, and that he is going to save us. We can believe and have faith in the promises that are promised. We can have faith in that, and we can trust in God's plan. And that's the action that God is asking us to do. That's that faith in action. So remember, Hebrews 11 is all about faith in action. So how can we put this into action for ourselves? How can we not only have faith and see the big viewpoint that Joseph had, but how can we learn from that? How can we see Joseph's story and how his faith, because that's what Hebrews is trying to do. It's trying to show us these examples from people in the Bible, from people that have worked God's plan and done what has been asked of them, even though it didn't make sense at all, but still had faith, because faith is something we cannot see. So let's read Hebrews 11:22 one more time. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. He knew that God would follow through with his plan, and we can do the same. We can have the faith of not only believing in our Lord and Savior in all the things that he said did, but also in what he says he's going to do. And we can also see that sometimes in our lives, when we're having a little bit of troubles and things just don't make sense, we don't understand why this is happening, we can still see that there's a greater plan. God has a greater plan, and that we can trust in that plan, because all of God's plans are for the good, and he's going to fulfill his promises. Isn't that something almost, the word that comes to my head is satisfying, but I think it's more like reassuring in this world of turmoil, this world of things that you just like, where is that coming from? What kind of evil is happening in this world? We can still have hope. We can still have hope that God is going to fulfill his promises. We don't have to live in fear. We don't have to be surprised at the next evil thing because we know that Jesus has already conquered this world. We know that Jesus is going to save us all, and we can have hope in that because we can know deep down in our soul that God has a plan that is overreaching yesterday and tomorrow. It's overreaching that. It's a plan that takes us to complete salvation, to be connected completely back to him. Not only just in this world now where we are part of the world, we're living in this world, but our only connection is the Holy Spirit. And God wants more for us. So he has promised to bring us home to him. Jesus says I think it's in John 15, that he is building rooms for every single one of us in his mansion, and they are going to be filled with all of the things that we need. And through that faith, we can be a shining hope to others around us. And we can let that hope keep continuing to build and grow inside of us. And through hope, we can slowly push down fear, and we can overcome fear. And in a way, that's what Joseph did. Can you imagine all the things that he had to go through? And each time, even in that dungeon, even when he was sold as a slave, he had hope in God. He had hope that God, and complete faith that God was going to follow through with what God said he was going to do. And we can have that. We can have that right now, today. And we can dwell on that. So in your time this week, think about that hope. Help it to fill you up. Help it to grow inside of you. Read the full story of Joseph. It's an amazing story. I know sometimes as kids we only get the little tidbits, but get into Joseph's story actually from the Bible and find and see his hope that he holds through his whole life, even in his hard times. We just finished with the Growing with God segment. I hope you enjoyed that. And now it is time to jump back into cooking from scratch. I have promised these 5 hacks throughout this episode, and now it is time to get to them. So number 1 is plan and prep ahead. When you're cooking from scratch, you can plan, and that means meal planning. One of the essential ingredients for successful from scratch cooking is a good planning. Take some time at the beginning of each week to plan your meals and create a shopping list. This will ensure you have all the necessary ingredients on hand and saves you multiple trips to the grocery store. Additionally, try prepping some ingredients ahead of time. You can cut up, I know I follow a couple Instagram people, and they cut up their potatoes and put them in water so that they don't turn black in the morning when they have the energy. Or you can can up some of those convenience foods like the canned potatoes, or you can chop up your meat, or you chop up your vegetables ahead of time, or you can get your meat marinating in the morning to save time, especially on a hectic weeknight, because the biggest thing with a plan is that you know what you're cooking that night. I think a lot of people avoid meal planning because it can feel restricting, but when I'm standing there at 5:30 at night, my husband's on his way home, kids are wondering what's for supper, and I don't know, is like my worst nightmare. It's like stressful. But when I sit down every Sunday and make my meal plan and know exactly what I'm going to cook that night, that means I can get the meat out of the freezer in the morning. See, that's another part of cooking from scratch. When you're buying from bulk, maybe you're not growing your own meat yet. You can still purchase your meat in bulk, put it in the freezer, and then you have more cost-effective meat, which protein is like the most expensive part of any meal. But I know what I'm getting out in the morning. I know what vegetables I need to prep, what kid maybe I could get to peel the potatoes at lunchtime, all of that. So when 5:30 hits, I'm standing in the kitchen cooking. I'm not standing in the kitchen wondering what's going to be served for supper. When I'm exhausted, when fatigue has set in, the day is a accumulated all day long. All the things that are on my shoulders. Supper doesn't have to be one of them, and other meals as well. You already know what you're going to have for breakfast. You already know what you're having for lunch, all of that. The next is that you can stock up on staple ingredients. I talked about the flour. Building a well-stocked pantry is a game changer for from scratch cooking. Keeping a variety of essential ingredients like flour, sugar, spices, oils, canned goods readily available. These can be ones you make, not right from the grocery store. This way you won't have to run to the store every time a recipe calls for basic ingredients. You can have a pantry stocked in case like a snowstorm happens. That's what happens here in Wyoming. And you're ready. You can have all of this ready to go, because when you cook from scratch, you can keep a lot of the ingredients on hand because a lot of it is dried ingredients. I think there's one episode before blog posts, I talk about the different seasonal foods that you could get during the different seasons. So like apples are best picked in fall, of course, and best purchased in fall. But what do you stock up in the winter with? Well, that's your pantry. So I talk about all the things you need for a well-stocked pantry. I will put that episode and blog posts in the description and show notes below, but it's going to help you go through all the things that you could stock up on in your pantry, because you could do beans for making chili. You can make your chili ahead of time. I've done that and canned it. There's so much you can do when you're stocking up on staple ingredients when it comes to cooking from scratch. The next thing is you can embrace one pot cooking and batch cooking. So what does that mean? Well, one pot means that you're only getting one pot dirty. You don't need to go all elaborate. That's the other thing about cooking from scratch that can feel intimidating, is that you think you need to have these really foo meals, and you don't. You can do batch cooking and one pot cooking, which is essentially you're using one pot. So examples would be stew or chili. The batch cooking would mean that you make some chili, but now you make chili for like 2 meals, and that second part of the chili you put in the freezer or you can it and you save it for later. That could be batch cooking. Or batch cooking means, okay, you're making enchiladas. Well, you can make 2 trays of enchiladas instead of 1 tray of enchiladas, so you can have enchiladas next week or next month if you freeze it. So there's lots of ways that you can save time in that, and also save time and effort with doing dishes. I'm not a big dishes person, so I do a lot of one pot meals. That can be things like chicken Alfredo, because you pull your noodles in the same pot that you are cooking your chicken and adding your Alfredo sauce and all the things. It's all in one pot. And batch cooking is amazing, especially when I make bread. I love making bread, but I like to make like 4 batches of bread and put it in the freezer. So then I only have to make that 4 batches of bread once a month instead of every week. So that can be really fun. Another great hack is get creative with leftovers. So yeah, you made chili and you saved half of it. Well, what can you do with the leftover chili from the meal? Well, you could have chili and hot dogs, or you could have chili and eggs. That's a big hit here. You could turn it into nachos. There's so much that you could do with chili that when you're cooking with convenience or you're cooking processed foods, you only have so many portions, and that's as far as it goes. But when you're cooking from scratch, you can make more and you can turn it into lots of things. So I even have an ebook that comes with the Planning Beyond the Harvest ebook that talks about utilizing a whole chicken. Because one of the things that happens when we purchase or are purchasing more whole ingredients, we go for the whole chicken instead of just the breast. Well, especially if you grow your own chicken, you have a whole chicken that you're dealing with. So in that ebook, I talk about how you can cook that whole chicken as a whole chicken and then break it apart to make tacos or a frittata or a bunch of other meals, or how you can piece the chicken and use the other pieces like breasts for chicken pot pie, or I make chicken and biscuits. Also using the thighs for stir fry or fried rice, and how to use the legs or the wings for this and the legs for that. So I'll include the link to that book so you can grab that extra resource as well. But that's one great part of cooking from scratch, is that you can cook more, but you can also utilize more parts of, say, the chicken, or more parts of the broccoli, or more things by just being creative and making even additional meals from one meal that you cooked earlier in the week. So our last hack is that you can invest in quality kitchen tools. Now, I have a, normal kitchen supplies, but I also have a bread maker. So guess what, ladies? I do not make all my bread by me standing in the kitchen kneading it for 10-20 minutes. I have a bread maker. I make my bread in my bread maker. Also, I have a knife sharpener that's not me sharpening my knife. I have an electric one, so I don't have to sharpen my knives. I have something that does it for me. There's tools. When I make biscuits, I can make in my food processor. I just put in the flour, dry ingredients. I cut in the butter with my food processor. It cuts all the butter in. I pour the milk right into my food processor as it's mixing, and I make drop biscuits. They're still nice and fluffy. I put them on the top of my stews for dumplings. I put them on the top of my chicken and biscuits. I put them on the top of my beef and biscuits, which is pretty much a stew cooked in the oven. There's so many things that I use those biscuits, and it doesn't take me a long time to do it because I have a food processor that helps me. Also, cutting up a lot of my things for my canning that I do. I have a food processor, helps me cut up and buzz all my tomatoes. So by utilizing and coming up with some appliances, and that's what's so great about today, is that there are appliances out there that can help you. You can make cooking from scratch not as hard, or it doesn't have to be as hard when you have those different hacks. So let's go through them one more time. 1, you plan ahead and prep ahead. I think in 2 episodes from now, I'm going to talk about meal planning. It doesn't have to be a drudgery, but it can be so beneficial when you are cooking from scratch because you know exactly what you're cooking that night. Number 2, you can stock up on staple ingredients. You can shop right from your larder first when you're doing your meal planning because you've stocked up and you've gotten all your ingredients ready and available for you. Not only are they readily available for you to cook from every week, but they're there in case of something happening, like a snowstorm here in Wyoming, or my car breaks down, I can't get to town. All those things can happen, and it feels good to have a stocked pantry and stocked freezers and know that if something were to happen, I have food downstairs. Number 2, embrace one pot or batch cooking. You can easily cook just a little bit more, especially if you're doing a Sunday dinner or a day that you don't have a busy weeknight. You can cook just a little bit more chili or a little bit more stew, or you can cook that whole chicken and you're only going to eat part of it, and then that whole chicken can go into another meal tomorrow, and so on and so forth. Number 4, you can get creative with leftovers. Number 5, you can invest in quality kitchen tools. Everything, even though it's cooking from scratch, it doesn't need to be done with your hands. You can use tools to help you out, like a food processor and a bread maker and a big nice mixer, because if I don't make bread in my bread machine, I make it in a mixer and that kneads it for me, so I don't have to stand there and knead it. I can turn the mixer on and it kneads it for me, especially when I'm making my cinnamon roll recipe, which I share lots of recipes. I don't know if you know this, but on the blog where you find my show notes, I have lots of recipes as well to help you utilize and learn to cook from scratch. And inside my book, Planning Beyond the Harvest, I have a whole back section in the back of the book to help you make a plan for the things that you grow, but it also has lots of recipes in there too. So if you're really hesitant about cooking from scratch and you want someone to help you figure out a meal plan, you want someone to walk you through all the ideas that I've talked about, grab that book. It's a great book and that's why I wrote it. It's so that you guys have a tool to help you learn to cook from scratch and utilize your harvest, because I think that is our end goal, is it not? When we're growing our own food, it's the harvest. It's consuming that food. And so many times, and I know this from past experience, we look at the growing and when we get to the harvest, we don't know what to do. So we need to make the plan for the harvest first and then work backwards to know what we want to grow. So for instance, if your favorite food is broccoli Alfredo, then you know you want to grow broccoli in your garden. And you know that the best food, the way you like to enjoy cooking broccoli Alfredo is from frozen broccoli, then you know that you're going to not only grow broccoli, you're going to grow this certain type of broccoli, but you're going to harvest it and then you're going to freeze it. So then you can use it in that recipe. That's what all Planning Beyond the Harvest is about. And that's what cooking from scratch can help you with. So I will put all the links, all of those good resources in the show notes. And I invite you to dig deeper in this topic by going to the Purposeful Growing Journey webpage. This is a webpage that I have broke down the 6 stages of purposeful growing. And that is the Just Grow stage, the Purposeful Kitchen stage, which we're talking about today, the Purposeful Home, the Purposeful Garden, the Purposeful Homestead, and the Purposeful Life. All of those stages walk you through and provide resources to you on how you can start growing your own food, creating purpose in your home, creating purpose in your kitchen, and in your life. So I want to thank you for joining me today in this episode. If you're new here, I want to welcome you to the Pray Just Plant podcast and the Fellowship of Fellow Growers. This is where you go to my website, you dive into some free resources that I have, and you join the newsletter. In that newsletter, you get weekly tips and tricks that I do not share here. They're additional, and you get access to monthly workshops and more. So come over and join the Red Ridge Farm Fellowship of Fellow Growers newsletter. So again, I want to thank you for joining me today in this episode. And as always, don't let the world hold you back. Pray, just plant.